Working in one of the city's oldest cemeteries, I had become accustomed to the silence of the night, but this one was different. The streets around, bustling with life during the day, at night transformed into empty corridors, bathed only by the weak moonlight and the occasional street lamps that seemed like flickering candles in the distance. On this particular night, the air was saturated with a dense fog that barely allowed the front gate to be visible, and the weather, usually ignored, made itself felt with a cold that seeped into the bones. My routine was simple: check the graves, ensure nothing was out of place, but that night, a presence seemed to toy with the perception of shadows. Each statue, each tombstone, seemed to hold a secret waiting to be unveiled, and with every step I took, the silence seemed to scream, as if carrying the voices of all those resting souls. Without a doubt, places like this are the perfect cradle for the urban legends we've heard since childhood. Suddenly, I heard what seemed to be footsteps, but looking back, I saw nothing but the emptiness and fog beginning to swallow even the glow of the lamps. My heart raced, and an unexplainable feeling of being watched completely overtook me. It was as if every corner of the cemetery hid curious eyes, ready to tell their own stories of terror and unresolved mysteries. I always thought I knew every stone and every corner of the cemetery, but that night seemed to have changed the rules of the game. As my steps echoed on the cold slabs, I remembered why many gravediggers prefer not to work after dark. Paranormal phenomena were frequent in tales, but I always considered them just urban legends, stories to scare the newbies. My route took me to the oldest section of the cemetery, where the almost forgotten graves barely stood out among the tall vegetation. It was here that I noticed something peculiar. One of the graves, known to house the remains of a child, had been left open. Curious and cautious, I approached, trying to discern if it was the work of vandals. However, the ground around was intact, as if the lid had simply been lifted and placed aside. Heavy breathing and a racing heart were the only responses from my body to what should have been just another night's work. Then I heard those steps again, this time accompanied by a low, almost imperceptible laugh. I turned quickly, only to see emptiness again. However, looking back at the grave, there she was, a small silhouette, partially obscured by the fog, staring at me with eyes that seemed colorless. It wasn't the first time I had seen things that defied explanation, but the sight of a child in the middle of the fog, in a cemetery at night, was something that chilled even the most skeptical of men. For over 20 years I've worked with the dead, but nothing had prepared me to deal with the living who shouldn't be there. Or was she also dead? I tried to approach, but my own fears rooted me to the ground. "Are you lost, girl?" My voice came out more like a whisper, betrayed by my unease. She didn't answer, just continued staring at me with those pale eyes, and in an instant, as if she were one of those apparitions from supernatural tales, she turned and began walking into the dense fog. I followed her without really knowing why. Perhaps it was curiosity or the inherent concern of an adult for a child alone in such a place. Each step I took seemed to increase my fear and confusion. What was she doing here? Was she one of those paranormal phenomena I'd always heard about? Or worse, was I witnessing one of those frightening cases I'd never hoped to confirm? The cemetery seemed even larger as I followed the small figure who glided between the tombstones as if floating. The fog thickened with each step, making the vision even more limited and the sounds muffled. The tension of the unknown made every shadow seem alive. Every whisper of the wind seemed like a distant voice trying to alert me, or perhaps call me closer to the unimaginable. Each moment I expected the girl to disappear, as part of some trick of my tired mind, but she continued there, always a few steps ahead, leading me deeper into the cemetery. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, my voice now firmer, though my courage didn't match the tone. Without looking back, she stopped next to an old abandoned chapel, whose doors seemed as inviting as the entrance to a tomb. And then the twist: as soon as I approached, the girl entered the chapel, and crossing that threshold, the environment changed. The temperature dropped drastically, and the silence was replaced by a distant echo of cries and murmurs. It was as if that place housed not only the dead but the stories and secrets they carried with them. Now, I wasn't just following a shadow in the fog. I was plunging into one of the inexplicable events that would forever change my perception. Now I will explore the fifth topic: supernatural and mysterious elements. I will continue the plot, focusing on repetitive patterns and strange objects and phenomena, with the same first-person narrative, rich in details and colloquialisms to enhance the mystery and suspense. Inside the chapel, the atmosphere was different. Each step echoed among the empty walls and the dust-covered benches. The girl had disappeared, but her trail seemed embedded in the cold air that surrounded me. The place, illuminated only by the weak light the moon could send through the broken windows, gradually revealed its secrets. On the altar, candles burned without anyone having lit them, and their reflections on the walls formed dancing shadows that seemed to whisper among themselves. I wasn't sure if what I was experiencing was real or just the fruit of the supernatural stories that echoed in my mind, stories that now seemed to come to life on their own. That's when I noticed, next to the altar, a small rag doll, worn by time but with a strange novelty. It cast no shadow. Still trying to understand that inexplicable phenomenon, I heard the chapel door slam behind me, as if sealing my entry or preventing my exit. I decided to investigate the doll more closely. As I approached, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and a sense of dread took hold of me. It was as if that simple object contained more stories and terror than all the graves outside. Then a faint but clearly audible voice echoed through the empty space. "You shouldn't be here." The voice seemed to come from the doll itself, and with it, the air filled with a sweet, old smell typical of places long closed. The doll's voice reverberated in my mind like bell chimes on a silent night. I instinctively recoiled, my breathing becoming rapid and shallow. I wanted to run, to flee from that place, but something kept me there, rooted by fear and curiosity. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking the oppressive silence. No answer came, just the echo of my own voice through the chapel's ancient walls. I then decided that I needed to understand what was happening, no matter how frightening it might be. I approached the doll again and lightly touched it with the tip of my fingers. The touch was enough to trigger a series of visions, quick flashes of a child playing in that same place, laughter that turned into screams, and finally silence. It was as if the doll held the essence of that child, her joys and her terrors. Still dazed by the visions, I left the chapel. The air outside seemed lighter, but the feeling that something had changed within me was undeniable. As I walked back to my routine, the memories of what I had seen and heard accompanied me, leaving an indelible mark. What had started as a simple night of work had turned into a journey through the shadows of the inexplicable. When I arrived home, the reflection in the mirror showed a man older and more tired than when the night had begun. The impact of that experience was not just physical, but deeply psychological. I knew the following nights would be different, that the dark corridors of the cemetery would hold new secrets and perhaps new terrors. But now there was also a tacit understanding. Some answers are not meant to be found, and some doors, once opened, never closed completely. That night, as I nestled under the covers, the darkness of my room seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Each shadow, each noise in the house transformed into a reminder of what I had experienced. Fear, this old companion, now had a new face, one that did not belong to this world but had crossed my path in an inexplicable way. Curiosity, however, is a flame that not even fear can extinguish. Lying there with wide eyes in the darkness, I wondered about the story of that child, about what had been so terrible as to leave her essence trapped in that doll, in that chapel. The mystery enveloped me, a net woven with threads of inexplicable events and hauntings that defied logic. My mind, though exhausted, refused to rest. The emotions of that night had marked me deeply, instigating a connection I hadn't known could exist between the world of the living and the dead. Fear mixed with a kind of reverent respect, an acceptance that there is more between heaven and earth than our vain philosophy dreams of. And so, between fear and fascination, I found myself caught in a cycle of reflection and discovery, where each shadow could be a door to new mysteries and each silence an invitation to explore the deepest secrets of the supernatural. In the days that followed, I tried to resume my routine, but the echo of those visions did not leave me in peace. One night, I decided to return to the chapel, driven by a need to understand, to see again that doll that seemed to be the key to everything I had experienced. But upon arriving, I realized that the door, previously jammed and difficult to open, now swung gently with the wind, inviting me inside. With hesitant steps, I entered the chapel under the dim light of the full moon. The place, previously just an old and gloomy building, now transformed before my eyes. The walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The murmurs of the past mingled with the wind entering through the broken windows, and each lit candle projected shadows that danced as if alive. Then I heard the sound of small steps running around, children's laughter echoing among the benches. The air charged with static electricity, and suddenly, all the chandeliers went out at once, plunging the place into total darkness. Only the moonlight, now a silent witness, offered some comfort. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw small figures, silhouettes of children, running back and forth, passing by me with icy touches that sent shivers down my spine. One of them stopped in front of me, the same girl from the first encounter, holding the doll. She extended her hand, and with a voice that seemed a whisper carried by the wind, said, "Now you understand, don't you? We are not trapped here. We are guardians of these secrets." And before I could respond, the girl and the other figures disappeared, leaving the doll at my feet, a final reminder that this familiar place was now a portal to stories and secrets far beyond my understanding. After that night, the cemetery was never the same for me. Each shadow seemed to whisper forgotten stories. Each wind brought echoes of distant laughter. I continued my work as a gravedigger, but with a new perspective. Those who rested under the tombstones were not just under my care, but were also my guides to the mysteries that the veil between life and death concealed. The doll, now kept in my house, served as a constant reminder of the lessons learned. It was not just an object, but a symbol of the secrets the cemetery held. Each glance at it reinforced the feeling that my connection to that place was deeper than simply caring for those who rested there. The nights, though still lonely, were now filled with a renewed purpose. I learned to listen to the stories the wind brought, to see the shadows as manifestations of past lives and not just as an absence of light. With each new night, a new chapter unfolded, filled with unsolved mysteries and inexplicable events that challenged my understanding, but which I now faced with respect and cautious curiosity. I conclude, therefore, that although we may never fully understand what happens after death, the experiences I've had have taught me that there is much more in our world than the eyes can see and reason can explain. And for those who are willing to listen, the dead have much to tell. It was a dark and cold winter night when I got the call to replace the gravedigger who had missed work. It was late, and the streets were deserted, lit only by streetlights casting long, sinister shadows. Upon arriving at the cemetery, the feeling of desolation was palpable. The aligned graves, the old twisted trees, everything seemed to conspire to create an atmosphere of tension. I always thought these scary cases were exaggerations, urban legends told to scare children, but that night I would understand that some real facts are more terrifying than any fiction. The rusty gate creaked as it opened, echoing through the silent environment. I walked to the small gravedigger's house, where the tools were stored. The wind whistled between the tombstones, bringing with it a cold that seemed to freeze the bones. Everything was too quiet, and that quietude was starting to make me uneasy. The cemetery, a place that should be of eternal rest, seemed to vibrate with a dark and evil energy. Each step I took was accompanied by the sound of gravel crushed under my feet, heightening the feeling that something was about to happen. Then, while organizing the tools, I heard a strange noise. It sounded like a distant, muffled moan, coming from somewhere between the tombstones. My heart raced, and reason tried to convince me it was just the wind. But that sound didn't seem natural. I set aside the tools and followed the noise, increasingly convinced that something was out of the ordinary. And then I saw, in a glimpse, a shadow moving quickly between the trees. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the growing fear in my chest said otherwise. I kept walking, and the closer I got, the louder the sound became. It was like a desperate lament, loaded with pain and suffering. The sense of dread grew every second, and I felt I was about to witness something inexplicable. As I turned the corner of a large tombstone, I came upon a crouching figure back to me. At first, I thought it was a grieving person, but something was wrong. The air was heavy, charged with an evil presence that made me hesitate. And then, the figure slowly stood up and turned around. My eyes locked onto hers, red as glowing embers, radiating a supernatural fury. My heart nearly stopped when the creature's eyes fixed on mine. The first reaction was shock, followed by paralyzing fear. I couldn't understand what I was seeing. That figure, human-like, but with eyes that shone an intense red, watched me with an expression that mixed curiosity and hatred. It was as if I had invaded its territory, breaking an invisible rule. Everything started innocently that night, just another work shift. Who could imagine that a task as mundane as that of a gravedigger would turn into one of the most terrifying supernatural accounts? I tried to step back, but it seemed like my feet were glued to the ground. Scary cases like this defy all logic and rationality. The sound of the moan continued, now closer and clearer, as if the creature was trying to communicate something. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't respond. The creature advanced slowly, and each movement was charged with a threatening aura. I began to wonder what could have brought that being there. Was it a spirit of someone buried in that cemetery? A paranormal phenomenon that defied any explanation? These thoughts made me even more terrified. The disappearances of other people in the cemetery, which I always attributed to exaggerations, now made sense. They had encountered the same thing as I had, and probably had not been lucky enough to leave there alive. The atmosphere became increasingly heavy. I felt as if an invisible hand was squeezing my chest, making it hard to breathe. The creature took another step forward, and I finally managed to move. I stumbled back, almost falling, but I couldn't take my eyes off those red eyes. The sense of dread increased, and every second seemed an eternity. Then the creature opened its mouth and let out a deafening scream, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of hell. Panic took over me, and I finally managed to run. I dodged the tombstones, running as fast as my legs would allow. The sound of the scream echoed in my ears, and I felt the creature approaching. It was as if every shadow in the cemetery came to life and tried to reach me. I looked back just once, and saw that the creature was chasing me with supernatural speed. I ran to the Gravedigger's house, my only hope of finding some refuge. Upon entering, I locked the door and backed away, trying to catch my breath and understand what had just happened. Inside the small Gravedigger's house, my heart raced uncontrollably, and my mind was in complete chaos. The sense of safety that those thin walls offered was illusory, but it was all I had at the moment. My thoughts were confused, trying to find a rational explanation for what I had just witnessed. Horror stories always seemed so far away, but now I was the protagonist of one of the scariest supernatural accounts. I sat in an old worn-out chair, trying to control my breathing. My hands trembled, and sweat ran down my forehead. I looked around, looking for something that could be used as a weapon, but the room was practically empty. There were only the Gravedigger's tools, which seemed useless against such a terrible creature. My thoughts returned to the encounter with those red eyes, and a wave of fear and restlessness took over me. It was as if the very presence of that creature had left a mark on my soul. Suddenly, I heard a scratch at the door. My body froze, and every fiber of my being screamed not to open it. But curiosity and dread were equally strong. I stood up slowly, each step seeming like a monumental effort. I leaned my ear against the door, and the scratching continued, now accompanied by a guttural, almost animalistic sound. I was trapped between terror and the need to do something. The figure outside was an anomaly, something that should not exist in our world. But there it was, insistent and real. The sound stopped suddenly, and the absence of noise was even more frightening. I backed away a few steps, keeping my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for something to happen. And it did. A violent thud made the door tremble, as if something had thrown itself against it. Fear turned into pure desperation. My mind tried to find a solution, a way to get out of that hellish situation. I thought of the reports of disappearances, the hauntings that seemed to haunt that place. Everything made sense now, and the truth was more terrifying than any urban legend. The creature would not give up easily. I felt that my only chance was to survive until dawn, when daylight could perhaps dispel that nightmare. Every minute seemed an eternity, and I needed to keep my sanity. I decided to block the door with a chair, a desperate attempt to buy time. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and began to pray. I'm not a religious person, but at that moment, any help was welcome. The dread, the confusion, and the sense of helplessness consumed me. I was at the mercy of forces beyond human comprehension, and all I could do was wait. Sitting on the floor, leaning against the cold, damp wall, I tried my best to keep calm. My prayers were constantly interrupted by the strange sounds coming from outside. The creature seemed to move around the small gravedigger's house, like a predator stalking its prey. With each noise, my body shrank more, and the feeling of vulnerability increased. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, I was at home on a normal night, without imagining that I would get involved in one of the most terrifying stories I had ever heard. Suddenly, the sound of heavy footsteps approached the window. I peeked through the curtain slit and saw the figure standing there, watching with those glowing red eyes. My heart jumped in my throat, and despair took over. That vision was a paranormal phenomenon that defied any explanation. It was as if the creature knew exactly where I was, and that made everything even more disturbing. The minutes dragged on, and the tension in the air was palpable. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. That's when I remembered an old passage that the Gravedigger had mentioned once, a hidden door that led to a tunnel used for emergencies. It was my only chance to escape that scary case. I got up slowly, trying not to make noise, and began searching for the passage. Each step was a risk, each movement could attract the attention of the creature. When I finally found the disguised door, I felt a thread of hope. I opened it carefully, revealing a narrow, dark tunnel that descended into the depths of the cemetery. The fear of the unknown was great, but the terror of the creature outside was greater. I entered the tunnel, closing the door behind me, and began to descend. The air was heavy, and the smell of mold and damp earth invaded my nostrils. Each step echoed down the narrow corridor, and I feared the creature might follow me. However, it was a risk I needed to take. The tunnel seemed to extend infinitely, and the darkness was almost total. I used the cell phone flashlight to light the way, but the battery was low, and I knew it wouldn't last long. As I advanced, I heard strange sounds around me. They could just be the natural noises of the tunnel, but in that state of terror, everything seemed threatening. My hands trembled, and sweat ran down my face. Time seemed to have stopped, and each second was torture. Finally, I saw a faint light in the distance. I quickened my pace, feeling a new wave of hope. Reaching the end of that tunnel meant escaping the nightmare and perhaps surviving to tell my story. The faint light in the distance seemed like a promise of salvation, a sign that my tortuous journey through the tunnel was coming to an end. As I approached, the cell phone flashlight finally went out, leaving me in total darkness for a few moments. My steps instinctively quickened, guided by the glimpse of the exit. However, the air around me seemed to get heavier, as if an invisible presence was watching me. I reached the end of the tunnel, which opened into a small clearing hidden in the middle of the cemetery. The full moon illuminated the place with a pale, ghostly light, creating long, sinister shadows. I looked around, trying to identify any sign of danger, but everything seemed quiet. Horror stories often talk about strange objects and phenomena, and that place exactly emanated that aura of mystery. I felt I was not alone, and that sensation of being watched was disturbing. While walking through the clearing, I saw something shining on the ground. I approached and found a small silver cross, partially buried in the earth. I picked it up, feeling a chill run through my body. Scary cases like mine always seem to have these inexplicable elements. The cross was a strange object, a symbol of protection that, at that moment, offered minimal comfort amid the horror. However, before I could understand better, I heard again the guttural sound the creature emitted, now closer. I looked around frantically, trying to locate the source of the sound. The shadows danced around me, and the sense of dread grew. The creature was close, very close. I decided to run, but my legs seemed made of lead, moving with difficulty. The clearing stretched in all directions, with no safe place to escape to. That's when I saw, in the distance, a small chapel, almost hidden by the trees. It was a hope, a refuge against the evil chasing me. I ran toward the chapel, feeling the creature getting closer and closer. Its screams echoed through the clearing, a sound that seemed to tear the very soul. I reached the chapel door and pushed it open with all my might. It opened with a loud creak, and I threw myself inside, quickly closing it. The silence inside the chapel was almost absolute, a surreal contrast to the chaos outside. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath and organize my thoughts. The chapel was covered in dust and spiderwebs, abandoned for a long time. However, inside, I felt a momentary peace, as if the walls offered some protection against the evil outside. I looked around and saw an old altar, with unlit candles and a dusty holy book. I approached the altar, feeling that this place had a story of its own, full of unresolved mysteries and inexplicable events. As I examined the altar, my thoughts were a whirlwind. The momentary peace was fragile, and I knew the creature would not give up easily. The chapel, although abandoned, seemed a temporary refuge against the supernatural evil that pursued me. I touched the holy book, feeling the rough texture of the dusty cover. Something inside me said that this place had a special importance, perhaps a last hope against the darkness outside. The silence was broken by a familiar sound, the scratching at the door. My heart raced again. The creature was there, trying to get in. My mind raced, searching for any solution. I prayed, asking for protection, but the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. The scratching intensified, turning into heavy blows against the door. I felt that time was running out. I grabbed the silver cross and held it tightly, as if it could repel the paranormal phenomenon threatening my life. Suddenly, a bright light shone through the chapel windows. I looked outside and saw the first ray of sunlight, announcing dawn. The daylight seemed to dissipate the darkness, and the blows on the door ceased. I waited, breathing heavily, trying to believe that I was finally safe. When the door slowly opened, revealing the cemetery now bathed in sunlight, there was no sign of the creature. It was as if it had never existed, an unresolved mystery that left me with more questions than answers. I walked outside, feeling the negative energy disappear with each step. The cemetery, which at night was a place of terror, now seemed ordinary, almost serene. But I knew that something supernatural had happened there. I returned to the Gravediggers' house, picked up my things, and left the cemetery, determined never to return. That experience left a deep mark on me, leaving a psychological impact that I would carry forever. The following days were difficult. I tried to resume the routine, but the memory of the red eyes and the guttural sound haunted me. I avoided talking about what happened, fearing no one would believe me. But I knew the truth. The horror stories, personal experiences, and inexplicable events I experienced were real. That cemetery hid dark secrets that might never be fully revealed. And I was one of the few people who knew the true extent of the horror that dwelt there. The end of that night left more than physical scars. It left a mark on my soul, a constant reminder that the supernatural is not just a figment of the human mind. Sometimes, unresolved mysteries remain to remind us that there is more in the world than we can understand. And as much as I wished to forget, I knew that experience would always be with me, a constant haunting in the shadows of my memory. Even with the sun shining and life returning to normal, feelings of fear and suspense remained with me. It was hard to explain the feeling of always being watched, as if the creature with red eyes was still nearby, hidden in the shadows of my mind. At night, common household sounds became terrifying, each creak or whisper transporting me back to that night in the cemetery. The emotional connection to the terror was intense, and my body still reacted with chills when remembering the details. Curiosity about what really happened consumed me. I spent hours researching horror stories, supernatural accounts, and paranormal phenomena in an attempt to find answers. But each search only increased the mystery. I found similar accounts, people who had experienced scary cases in cemeteries or isolated places, but no one seemed to have faced something as intense as I did. The feeling of isolation was profound, as if I was the only one carrying that burden. The emotions were a whirlwind. Fear, of course, but also a strange sense of privilege. as if having survived that night made me part of an exclusive club, those who have seen what most will never see. This connection with the supernatural left me uneasy, but also curious. It was a disturbing duality. I wanted to forget, but at the same time, I wanted to understand more about those inexplicable events. Each day was a struggle between leaving the past behind and diving deeper into unresolved mysteries. My everyday life transformed. Before, I was a practical person, with little room for the supernatural or the inexplicable. But after that night, everything changed. The dread was not just a memory, but a part of me. I felt I needed to share my story, perhaps find others who had gone through something similar. This desire to tell made me start jotting down everything, detailing each sensation, each moment of dread. It was like therapy, but also an attempt to connect with those who understood true terror. The psychological impact was undeniable. Moments of calm were rare, and the night always brought a new wave of anxiety. I decided to seek professional help, someone who could help me deal with the traumas of that experience. That's when I discovered that, as uncommon as my accounts were, there were others like me, carrying stories that defied logic and reason. This discovery brought a bit of comfort, a small hope that I was not alone in my fear. That cemetery, which was once just a workplace, became the epicenter of my nightmares. An environment that should have been familiar and safe, where the routine was predictable and monotonous, was transformed into a stage of pure terror. Every detail of that place now had a new meaning. Each tombstone, each twisted tree, was a reminder of what I had faced. Horror stories often explore this break from normality, and I lived it firsthand. Returning to the cemetery, even in broad daylight, was a challenge. Everything seemed different, as if the place had a new dark life that only I could see. The corridors between the tombstones, once common paths, now seemed like labyrinths of fear and despair. The shadows that danced at dusk were suspicious, each one hiding potential danger. It was hard to believe that just a few weeks ago, I walked there without the slightest concern. The transformation of that environment was a paranormal phenomenon in itself, an unresolved mystery that I carried with me. The small Gravedigger's house, a refuge during work, became a place of hauntings. The sound of the creaking door, which was once just annoying, now was a harbinger of something terrible. Each visit, I expected to hear the scratches or see the shadow of the creature. The familiarity of the place made the fear even more intense. Scary cases often occur in familiar places, and this increases the psychological impact. It was as if the very essence of the cemetery had changed, as if it was impregnated by evil. Even outside the cemetery, the feeling of danger persisted. My home, my place of comfort, seemed less safe. Every night sound, every crack in the walls, made my heart race. The night, which should have been a time of rest, was now a period of vigilance and anxiety. Supernatural accounts of familiar environments transformed into scenes of terror replayed in my mind, and I couldn't escape this new reality. The world, once so predictable, was now full of inexplicable events. To try to regain some normality, I began to change my routine. I avoided any contact with the cemetery as much as possible and tried to occupy my mind with other activities. But the shadow of that night was always present, a living horror story in my memory. Feelings of fear and insecurity were always lurking, ready to emerge at any moment. The familiarity of places that once comforted me now was a constant source of tension and dread. Each passing day seemed to take me deeper into an abyss of terror and uncertainty. The routine that once offered predictable comfort was now tinged with constant fear. Nights were especially difficult, and what was once just a feeling of restlessness turned into pure terror as the sun set. The shadow of the creature, with its glowing red eyes, was a constant presence in my mind. The feeling of being watched never left me, and every sound, however minor, made my heart race. It was on one of those nights, when I was almost managing to fall asleep, that I heard a strange noise coming from outside my house. I got up carefully, feeling the dread grow with each step. The darkness of the night seemed even denser, and the sound repeated, now louder and closer. I grabbed the silver cross I had found in the cemetery and went downstairs, each step a challenge to my self-control. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment before slowly opening it, fearing what I might find on the other side. Outside, everything was quiet. The silence was almost palpable, and the darkness seemed to envelop everything. I took a few steps outside, trying to identify the source of the sound. That's when I saw, out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving quickly among the trees. My eyes widened in fear when I realized that the creature was there, watching me again. The feeling of dread was overwhelming, and I knew I needed to act quickly. I ran back inside the house, locking the door behind me. The guttural sound the creature emitted began again, resonating like an evil echo in my mind. I went upstairs and entered the bedroom, trying to regain my composure. I knew I needed to face that terror somehow, but I had no idea how. The constant fear and feeling of vulnerability were consuming me. I looked out the window and saw the red eyes glowing in the darkness, staring at me. It was as if the creature was feeding on my fear, gaining strength with each passing night. I was trapped in a cycle of terror and anxiety, and I saw no way out. I decided I needed to do something drastic. I gathered some candles and the holy book I had found in the chapel, feeling it was my last hope. I lit the candles and began to read aloud, trying to invoke some protection against the evil that pursued me. With each word, the environment seemed to get heavier, as if a malevolent presence was intensifying. The creature outside began to bang on the door again, each blow resonating like a hammer on my soul. I continued reading, my voice trembling but determined, trying to keep the faith that it would work. The feeling of dread reached its peak when the door began to give way. The creature was almost entering, and I felt that my time was running out. I continued the reading, now almost shouting, hoping that some divine force would intervene. Then, a flash of light flooded the room, blinding me momentarily. When I regained my vision, the creature had disappeared. The silence returned, and the feeling of immediate danger dissipated. I didn't know if I had really defeated that evil force or if it had just retreated temporarily. What I did know was that moment of pure terror would be etched in my mind forever. The days that followed were of tense calm. The feeling that the creature might return at any moment accompanied me, but there was a fragile hope that somehow the ritual on the night of the peak of dread had worked. I began to rebuild my routine slowly, but fear was a constant shadow. Every noise at night, every suspicious movement, brought back the memory of those red eyes. Experiences as intense as this leave deep scars, and the feeling of uncertainty and fear remained with me. My life changed irreversibly. The cemetery, which was once just a workplace, became a symbol of the terror I experienced. Even during the day, I avoided passing by there. The small chapel where I found some refuge now seemed a sacred and at the same time cursed place. The candles and the holy book I used on the night of the final confrontation became amulets, a reminder that something supernatural and inexplicable had happened. But what bothered me the most was the lack of definitive answers. Supernatural accounts and unresolved mysteries continued to haunt my thoughts. I went back to work, but in another place, far from the cemetery. My new routine was still marked by fear and caution. Each time night fell, the dread returned, and I wondered if the creature would come back. My everyday life had transformed into a constant state of alert. The memories of that night were always present, and I knew I could never completely forget them. Inexplicable events like the one I experienced mark us in ways that are hard to describe. The feeling of having faced something beyond our world is something that stays with you forever. I told my story to a few people, but few believed me. Horror stories and scary cases are often dismissed as the fruit of a creative or disturbed mind. But I knew the truth. The emotions I felt, the absolute dread, were real. And in some way, sharing my experience was a way to exorcise the inner demons that night brought. Each account, each memory, was an attempt to deal with the psychological impact of the terror I faced. Even today, when night falls, I look at the shadows with suspicion. The feeling that something is watching me never completely disappeared. Fear became a constant companion, a subtle presence in my life. But I also found an unexpected strength. Surviving that night, facing the supernatural, and continuing to live showed me that I am stronger than I thought. The experience changed me, and as terrifying as it was, it also taught me about resilience and courage. If you've made it this far, you've probably felt a bit of the terror I experienced that night. Real and scary accounts of gravediggers, like mine, are a reminder that there is much more between heaven and earth than we can understand. Stories like this show us that the supernatural may be closer than we think, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. As night fell heavily over the cemetery, a waning moon bathed the tombstones in a ghostly glow. I, a gravedigger for over 2 decades, had never gotten used to the silence that envelopes this place after dark. I worked beside an old oak, whose branches seemed to scratch the night sky. In this setting, tales of hauntings and urban legends had always been whispered among us, the night shift workers. But that night, something beyond the usual rumors awaited me. While digging a new grave, I felt a cold breeze that hadn't been there before, a sign that the old-timers said was a precursor to paranormal phenomena. Suddenly, I saw in the distance 2 figures dressed in old-fashioned attire, 2 elderly people walking slowly among the graves, their features dimly lit by the moonlight. I thought they were just nocturnal visitors, but something about them didn't seem right. These apparitions were not common, even for me, accustomed to the lonely nights in this place of unresolved mysteries. The elders appeared to be conversing with each other, completely ignoring the natural laws of time and space, passing through the tombstones as if they were mere illusions. As they approached, their faces began to reveal more disturbing details, empty stares and skin pale as snow. The most unsettling part was that, despite their visible presence, no sound of their footsteps could be heard. This type of inexplicable event was exactly what transformed a familiar environment, like my workplace, into a scene of pure terror. The experience left me with a growing sense of dread, a story I knew would become another of the supernatural tales we would share in whispers, questioning the reality of our existence in the face of such hauntings. The night shift always started routinely: check the tools, light the lanterns, and prepare the ground for the next day's services. That night, after the encounter with the 2 elders, normalcy unraveled. I decided to follow the figures to try to understand whether what I was seeing was real or just the result of fatigue. As I drew closer, I noticed they occasionally stopped, leaning over certain graves and murmuring words that the wind prevented me from understanding. Intrigued and driven by a macabre curiosity, I followed the silent steps of the ghostly visitors. The scene became increasingly strange, as some objects on the grave seemed to move without intervention. Candles lit themselves, and shadows danced on the walls of the crypts, distorting reality around me. Suddenly, one of the elders turned abruptly, staring at me with eyes that seemed to see through my soul. That's when I realized there were no pupils, just pure white, as if time had erased any trace of humanity. He pointed to the grave I had been digging earlier, and in a whisper that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves, he said something that chilled my blood: "You shouldn't be here." This was the innocent beginning that turned into something totally inexplicable. Still frightened, I decided not to heed the warning and continued to follow them, trying to unravel the mystery of these anomalies. The night, which began with such a mundane task, transformed into a plot of disappearances and strange behaviors, typical of the scary cases we so feared. As the night progressed, my heart beat faster, echoing the rhythm of the growing tension I felt. I, who had spent my life among the dead, always believed I was immune to the fears that plagued the living when they thought about cemeteries at night. However, that situation was testing the limits of my courage. The elders, now clearly more than mere ghosts, seemed to be leading me on a journey through the unknown, a sort of ritual that I, unwittingly, had become a part of. With each step I took, the stories I had heard about paranormal phenomena and the personal experiences of the old gravediggers began to make sense. They were tales of visions and similar encounters, always dismissed or justified by fatigue or fertile imagination. But now, confronted with the reality of these apparitions, doubts turned into genuine fear. My breathing became heavy, my hands trembled, and restlessness dominated every thought. The empathy I felt for those who had gone through similar experiences grew, and confusion about what was really happening intensified. Each glance I exchanged with these figures, each gesture I observed, made me question not only what they were but what they wanted from me. The uncertainty of the situation and the fear of the unknown brought palpable tension. I felt that each moment might reveal something terrible and at the same time enlightening about the world I thought I knew. The reality of my job, which I had always considered safe and predictable, was transformed into a stage of horrors that defied any logic or reason. As I followed the elders, a peculiar detail captured my attention with every step. They seemed to be following a meticulously planned route, stopping at specific graves and murmuring incomprehensible prayers. The cemetery, a place I knew like the back of my hand, was transformed into a dark labyrinth of secrets and revelations. Each new grave they visited seemed to be connected to a larger story, a frightening puzzle that I was desperately trying to piece together. It was as if each grave hid a fragment of an inexplicable event, a piece of a larger mystery that was slowly unfolding before my eyes. The tension grew as I anticipated the ghost's next move. What would I discover at the end of this macabre trail? What was the connection between these graves and the nocturnal visitors? The strange behavior and repetitive patterns I observed in the elders were hooks that pulled me deeper into the mystery. Each action of theirs, every whisper to the wind, seemed to be a crucial piece that I was yet to fully fit together. Curiosity mixed with fear impelled me to continue, despite the inner voice whispering for me to retreat. Moreover, the absence of normal sounds, the hooting of an owl, the rustling of leaves, enhanced the otherworldly atmosphere. It was as if we were enveloped in a bubble of alternate reality, where only paranormal phenomena dictated the rules. The expectation of unraveling the end of this unusual night kept me alert, my heart beating in a frenetic rhythm of suspense and fear. As the night advanced, the phenomena around us became stranger and more disturbing. As we approached an ancient grave, the elders stopped, and the ground beneath our feet began to tremble lightly, as if something or someone was trying to emerge from its eternal prison. That's when I noticed, for the first time, a small object at the edge of the grave, a pocket watch apparently old, but in perfect condition, as if it had been left there just a few minutes ago. With an almost reverent gesture, one of the elders picked up the watch, opened it, and to my surprise, the time inside it seemed to run backwards. The hours regressed rapidly, an inexplicable cycle challenging the laws of physics. This moment was a clear example of strange objects and phenomena that added a deep layer of mystery to our supernatural journey. Additionally, on several occasions during our journey, I noticed that our shadows seemed to move independently, as if they had a life of their own. At one point, as we passed under the moonlight, my shadow simply disappeared, while those of the elders lengthened and distorted, creating almost human shapes that danced macabrely over the tombstones. These repetitive and disturbing patterns of supernatural elements suggested an inexorable cycle, a plot that repeated itself night after night, each time with greater intensity. The notion of being caught in a repetition of mysterious and inexplicable events amplified the horror of the situation, making me question the reality of everything I was experiencing. As the night neared its climax, the path we followed led us back to the starting point, near the grave I was digging when I first spotted them. The elders stopped, their white eyes glowing under the light of the waning moon, and pointed to the open grave. With a synchronized movement, they both turned to me, a gesture that seemed to contain a silent invitation, or perhaps a warning. "This is where it all ends, or perhaps where everything begins again," murmured one of them, his voice a ghostly whisper that dissipated with the wind. There was no clarity, just the weight of an enigma that I knew would not be resolved that night, or perhaps ever. They began to fade away, as if being absorbed by the night mist, leaving behind the pocket watch on the grave, its hands still moving backward. The psychological impact of this experience was profound. In the days that followed, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, questioning every shadow and every whisper of the wind. The uncertainty of what had really happened haunted me, a sense of trauma that accompanied me during my night work. The cemetery, which had always been a place of quiet and solitude, now carried an air of mystery and dread, a constant reminder of the hours that passed backward and the shadows that danced freely. In the nights that followed the encounter with the elders, my perception of the cemetery and my own role in it changed drastically. With each work shift, anxiety grew, as did the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes. The pocket watch, which I kept with me as a physical reminder of that night, seemed to be a key to a world I was just beginning to understand, a world where the boundaries between past and present blurred. On one of those nights, as the full moon illuminated the outlines of the tombstones, I decided to face my fears. I walked the same routes we had followed, trying to trigger some phenomenon or obtain some answer. The silence was disturbing, broken only by the sound of my steps and the distant echo of a crow. The air carried a static electricity, a harbinger that something was about to happen. Suddenly, a cold breeze blew, and the shadows around seemed to come to life, moving in an abnormal and unsettling manner. The watch in my pocket began to vibrate lightly, as if it were tuned to the supernatural energy of the night. My heart beat so loudly that the sound seemed to resonate through the cemetery, each beat a cry of fear and anticipation. Then, without warning, the figures of the elders reappeared, clearer than ever, their pale faces illuminated by the moonlight. "You still don't understand, do you?" said one of them, his voice laden with a weight I felt in my soul. "You are now part of this, part of a cycle that cannot be broken." The words were an enigma, a promise of deeper and more disturbing mysteries than I could imagine. The tension that night reached its peak when, looking at the watch, I noticed that time was not only running backwards but seemed to be taking me to moments of my own life, glimpses of past days that intertwined with the secrets buried under the graves I cared for. The cemetery, my workplace for so many years, had transformed into a stage for living nightmares. What once was a refuge of tranquility and solitude now revealed itself as a territory of unknown horrors. The familiarity of the environment, with its known routes and routines, became the basis for a new terrifying perception. Each shadow, each whisper of the wind, seemed to carry a hidden threat, a dark secret waiting to be uncovered. The trees, once mere reference points in the vast expanse of the cemetery, now seemed like silent observers, their leaves whispering judgments and secrets in a language I was beginning to feel but still did not understand. The old oak, under which I had often sheltered during storms, now seemed to contain a presence of its own, as if it held the memories of every soul that had passed through its roots. In this transformation of the environment, each element that once offered me comfort now became a source of unrest. The Gravedigger's tools, once symbols of my craft and control over the sacred space, now seemed like instruments of ancient and forgotten rituals, each shovel of earth removed revealing not just the soil but also layers of untold stories. One night, while walking down the central alley, the moonlight revealed strange patterns on the path, as if shapes and symbols had been engraved in the earth, visible only under the right light. These symbols, strangely familiar and yet completely alien, formed a map that I was reluctant but compelled to follow. Following the mysterious symbols engraved in the ground, I arrived at a part of the cemetery I rarely visited, a forgotten corner where the oldest tombstones stood, covered in moss and oblivion. It was as if each step took me deeper into a spiral of time and memory, each tombstone narrating a part of a larger story, not yet fully revealed. As the night progressed, a thick fog began to form, enveloping everything with a veil of mystery and concealment. The atmosphere, already charged with tension, now seemed almost palpable, as if the very air was saturated with the energies of past lives and unrevealed secrets. That's when I realized that the elders had disappeared, leaving me alone in this darker part of the cemetery. However, the feeling of being watched persisted, stronger than ever. I heard whispers, almost imperceptible, that seemed to echo directly from the fog, indistinct words that called to me, trying to guide me further into the unknown. I hesitated, overcome by fear and curiosity. I knew that moving forward might reveal truths that might be better left hidden, but the need to understand what was happening, to decipher the cycle I was caught in, was irresistible. I decided to follow the call of the whispers, each step increasing my anxiety and the feeling that I was about to discover something monumental, or perhaps something terribly disturbing. With each step I took toward the whispers guiding me, the fog became denser, almost solid, as if trying to completely envelop me, isolating me from the world I knew. The voices, now clearer, spoke in tones of plea and warning, merging into a ghostly chorus that seemed to emanate directly from the ground beneath my feet. The charged atmosphere and the growing sense of dread transformed my journey into an almost transcendental experience. The fear I felt was palpable, but there was also a strange acceptance, as if part of me already knew that there was no turning back, that whatever I found in this forgotten part of the cemetery would change my perception of reality forever. As I advanced, the outlines of the tombstones began to distort, the inscriptions on them seemed to change before my eyes, telling stories of past lives that somehow were interlinked with my own existence. It was as if each grave was a chapter of a book I was destined to read, a narrative intertwined with my soul. The climax of the tension came when I reached the center of the cemetery, where an ancient mausoleum stood, more imposing and gloomy than I remembered. The door, normally closed and locked, was wide open, inviting or challenging my entry. The air around pulsed with an almost visible energy, and the dread I felt reached its peak. I knew that crossing the threshold would face me with the absolute unknown, a confrontation with forces that challenged not only my understanding but the very essence of what it means to be human. With heavy breathing and trembling hands, I crossed the threshold of the mausoleum. Inside, the air was cold and charged with an electricity that made the skin prickle. The moonlight, filtered through a small window at the top, illuminated the interior with an ethereal glow, revealing a series of ancient coffins lined against the walls. In the center, a stone pedestal supported a thick book, its leather worn and the pages yellowed by time. I approached the book, and upon touching it, I felt a wave of images and sensations flood my mind. These were memories, not mine, but of countless souls that had passed through this place, each leaving a fragment of their story. The pages turned by themselves, stopping at an entry that seemed to be waiting for me. It was the story of the two elders, revealing themselves not just as former residents of the town, but as guardians of its darkest secrets, charged with guiding the lost and the curious to the truth hidden in this cemetery. As I finished reading, the book closed abruptly, and a profound silence settled, as if time itself had stopped. When I looked up, the elders were there, smiling in a way that was both comforting and terribly solemn. "Now you know," said one of them, "and to know means to remember always." They disappeared as if made of mist, leaving me alone with the heavy truth and the countless stories this place held. I left the mausoleum feeling different, as if part of me had been left behind, intertwined with the legends and mysteries of the cemetery. As I returned to the light of the morning that was beginning to brighten the horizon, I knew that this experience was just the beginning. There are more mysteries out there, waiting for those brave enough to explore. Are you ready to delve into the shadows and uncover the secrets hidden in the darkest places?